I often find myself fortunate to come from the small, idyllic peninsular province on Canada's east coast called Nova Scotia. The land is ancient and has a history unlike any other. It is rife with the legends of its indigenous peoples known as the Mi'kmaq. It encompasses stories of the earliest settlers to our country and the province, and even those that interweave between the two. This week's story is another like the one of Mary Ellen, the fire spook of Caledonia Mills, who I told you about in chapter 33. This story is of an entity so dark that its aura is felt by all of those who enter its woods. It hides in wait for those foolish enough to stumble upon it, and those who do, historically, were never seen again. This episode is also the revival of our ever-popular series, one which has laid dormant for 6 months. I'm your host, Nick, and you're listening to a brand new chapter of the Insidious Agenda podcast. This is the latest edition of the Folklore Appendices and the story of the Dagger Woods Howler, better known as the Hidey Hinder. As you make your way along the Highway 104 from Halifax, the capital city of Nova Scotia, along the province's northeastern shore, about 14 kilometers outside of the town of Antigonish, you'll pass a sign along the highway, one that seems relatively unassuming, as most road signs usually do. That sign is for the small community and woodland known as Dagger Woods. But whether you know today's story or not is what determines if you'll give it more than a thought as you pass by. Today, Dagger Woods is a small community with a few businesses and relatively small population that flank the sides of the small highway that runs through it. But as you stray from the road and enter the dense woods and marshes beyond the built-up areas, you're entering the domain of something mysterious, a dark, mischievous, and malevolent entity. In the lands formerly known as Acquainted, Dagger Woods, as far back in time as the late 1700s, reports began to show up that something dwelt in the area. From these reports arose the legend of the Dagger Woods Howler, or, as it's better known to the locals, the Hidey Hinder. Every story, whether it involves a human or some kind of inhuman entity, must have a beginning. The Hidey Hinder's origin is, in itself, shrouded in folk legend, like its later stories. Possibly the greatest rendition of this is told by Nova Scotia's own band, the Stanfields. With their permission, I've included this song at the end of the episode, just between the episode content and our outro. Now, the origin story of the Hidey Hinder is relatively short, so how I'll tell it to you will be a bit of a dramatization. And what I mean here is that I'll insert parts of the story that the Stanfields tell, as well as other realistic historic details to add color. But nonetheless, it will all respect the source material. One day, a man, his wife, and their 2 young children decide to go out camping one weekend. This is said to have been around a time known as Indian Summer. Now, for those who are unfamiliar with the term, Indian Summer is a period between late October and usually Remembrance Day on the 11th of November. It brings with it a period of unseasonably warm and dry weather. As the sun dips down over the horizon, the warm and hazy days give way to cool nights. For those who haven't experienced an autumn in Nova Scotia, I can tell you, hand to heart, that there is without a doubt no more beautiful place in the entire world at that time. And yes, that's a hill I'm willing to die on. Pardon the expression. The family had a full day, whether they were traveling from the town of Antigonish, or even if they had already set up and were into their weekend of fun and excitement. In the morning, they arrived in Dagger Woods and found a beautiful glade, one that was filled with the beautiful colors of a Nova Scotia autumn. They were surrounded by the sounds of a warm autumn breeze, weaving its way about the trees that bore leaves of vibrant red, orange, and yellow. It was far too beautiful to pass up, and they decided this is where they were going to set up for their family weekend. One can only imagine they had a beautiful day of hiking and maybe fishing, filling up the day with beautiful memories, ones they'd cherish forever. Or, at least until the sun went down. They would have sat down to dinner, laughing and telling stories about their day. Jill, the mother's name that was given by the Stanfields, might have cooked up a wonderful trail dinner. Who knows? It might have even been the fish they caught that day if they were fortunate enough to bring some back. Nonetheless, the family was exhausted. Dad lit a fire, and the family was all sitting around it. He regaled his children with spooky campfire stories, and smiled as he frightened them, laughing with them at the end of the telling. But something broke their silence. In the distance was a howl. It wasn't close to their sight, though, and being in the rural parts of northeastern Nova Scotia, they didn't really think much of it. After all, wolves and coyotes were known to be in the area, and were more often afraid of people than they were of it. As the children slowly start to doze off, Jill and her husband get them ready for bed and tuck them in, when a howl is heard again. This time, it sounded closer and stranger. Jill looks at her husband, frightened at the prospect they might have to fend off a coyote. But her husband reassures her that everything is okay. They have a lit fire, and he brought with them the family heirloom, a pearl-handled dagger, one that had come with the family from the old world. Again, not fearing the coyote, Jill and her husband went back to their campfire. They sat together, talking and cuddling up to one another, watching the dying embers of their fire and the last breathing flames of the day. As they sat, enjoying the silence of each other's company, the howl from the woods was heard again, not from any great distance, but from just across the small glade where they were encamped. The more frightening aspect of this was that they knew it wasn't a sound of a wolf or a coyote, but something else, and the sound was deafening. Something had awoken from its deep sleep in Dagger Woods. Jill retreated to her children, who had awoken from the loudness of the howling and were frightened beyond that which words can express. Her husband armed himself with the dagger and called out at the thing that was tormenting them, hoping to scare it off back to where it came. After only moments that seemed like eternity, the husband turned around to check on his family. He reassured them that everything was fine and whatever animal it was probably wanted their food, but saw the fire and got scared. He picked up his youngest daughter to comfort her when she looked over his shoulder and asked, "Daddy, What's that? Just beyond his left ear, the husband heard something emerge from the woods and walk towards them. As he turned around slowly, he lay his eyes upon it. Amid the glade, only meters before them stood something. It was large. It had large eyes, and both Jill and her husband knew, deep down, that it wanted something. It wanted them. It wanted their souls. And it wanted to fulfill its most primal need, the need to feed. The husband's eyes retreated to his wife's. He could see the abject terror beset on her face and the tears welling up behind her eyes. The children's faces buried into their mother's dress. It took everything he had to pull his eyes away from Jill's. He stood up and turned to face their tormentor. Dagger in hand, he advanced slowly towards it. Coming only feet from it, the entity howled again. A sound so deafening that it had made him cover his ears, dropping the dagger in the process. And that's when it made its move. The Hidey Hinder rushed him, hitting him so hard it knocked him to the ground. As he lay on the ground and the ringing in his ears subsided, his opening eyes were met with a frightening sight. He saw what no man should ever see. He watched the entity dragging his wife Jill and his children off into the darkness of the woods. He was helpless to move from the injuries the Hidey Hinder had inflicted on him, and was left with only the sounds of their screaming, which, like the howling that brought this terrible thing towards them, grew less and less until everything was silent. He was alone, for the Hidey Hinder had taken its family to its lair, somewhere deep in Dagger Woods. The story of what happened to the husband goes two ways, and the two can interweave depending on which legend you want to believe. Quite often, the legend of the Hidey Hinder is attributed to a crime of passion. The local and most well-known legend is that a man killed his wife and children with a pearl-handled dagger. When he realized what he had done, he ran off into the darkness of Dagger Woods, and was never seen or heard from again. The result of the murder was that he awoke an ancient spirit in the woods, one that took hold of him. Another legend is that he is the Hidey Hinder, inflicted by the spirit and forever doomed to live out the darkness of his deeds. Others say that the Hidey Hinder is something evil, whether it existed in those woods since the dawn of time, or came over with the settlers when they colonized the New World. Either explanation doesn't really matter, because nonetheless, we know that the Hidey Hinder is some form of ancient evil, whether corporeal or ethereal. Another legend is that when the family stumbled upon it, it killed his family and took him instead. Into modern day, the Hidey Hinder is an entity that either cannot or will not choose to rest. Another theory of the husband is again presented by the Stanfields, sort of in line with the lone survivor theory, and their explanation is quite creative and amazing, but I'll let them tell that one, so make sure you listen to their iconic song Dagger Woods, coming up at the end of the episode, just before the outro. Outside of the origin stories, what exactly do we know about the Hidey Hinder and its legends from those who have lived in the area? Well, one of the better accounts is that of a young girl from Dagger Woods named Saundra Gerard. Saundra's family was well known for selling blueberries, which they sold to locals and those passing by for 10 cents a cup. Saundra would set off each morning to the blueberry bushes and pick them for her family. One day, she was told by her mother that the blueberries she picked were going to be used for baking, and were not going to be sold off, as they usually did. Saundra didn't question her mother. After all, she loved her mother's homemade blueberry muffins, especially when they were fresh and warm right from the oven and spread with a decent layer of butter. She could hardly wait. Again, and this definitely isn't bias here, but there are no better blueberries in this world than those from Nova Scotia, be they from the Annapolis Valley, Oxford, or elsewhere. They're to die for. And I imagine they tasted as good in the 1700s as they do today, probably even more so. To get the best blueberries for baking, Saundra knew she'd have to wander further than she normally did, something she dreaded. Not for stories she had heard, but for the walk out and back. The thickest and juiciest blueberries were deep in Dagger Woods. Now Saundra wasn't scared of any old thing in the woods, but what she was truly terrified of was summer vacation winding to a close and having to go back to school soon. She said the door to the schoolhouse, with its open doors like a dragon's jaws, scared the life out of her. She wanted to be outside. She wanted to live and not be chained to her desk all day long, especially since the best hours to be outside were when it was bright and warm and sunny, and school took that away. Saundra, I get you, girl. Amen. But she did know the stories, especially the ones told to her by Uncle Roderick. He told stories of the demon of Dagger Woods, ever stalking about on its hunt for fresh meat. The version of the story that Saundra knew really well was that a man died in a knife fight in those woods, and his restless soul wandered ever since, waiting to exact his revenge. But the one that stuck with her the most is the one her father told her. You'll hear it, sneaking and creeping up on you just behind your left ear. But try as you might, you can't see it. Turn as fast as you like, and the Hidey Hinder is that much faster. It's worse than trying to catch a mosquito when blindfolded. The Hidey Hinder keeps in your shadow, hiding just behind you, and the only way you can save yourself is to catch a glimpse of it. That's the hard part. He always moved just that much too fast to be caught. Some say it's just a fooler, a minor-level trickster who is looking for a giggle on you. Others say that it will cause you to panic and run, and that the bones of those who died of exposure and lie lost in the woods are usually scarred by the long-fanged hunger marks of the Hidey Hinder. But again, Saundra wasn't scared of stories. Having traveled the woods many times before, she was a great navigator, and always able to correct her position if she got lost. Her father told her to always follow the stream, and she could find her way back home. So she set off, knowing that the woods were a dangerous place to begin with. Saundra knew to be careful, and keep a steady and sure-footed stride as she walked amongst the trees. Her secret spot was one that had burned over some 10 years ago, and nothing grew blueberries like a burned-over patch of woodland. She came upon her spot, flanked by pines, and began picking the berries there. A short while later, the rock on which she stood tipped over and caused her to lose her balance. It scared her to the point of holding her breath. Snap! The sound of a branch behind her snapped, likely from some animal. As Saundra turned around, expecting to see a deer or a rabbit, she saw nothing. There was a slight panic for a moment, but more so because it was late autumn, and she was concerned it might have been a bear, trying to fatten itself up before a long winter's nap. Again, another snap caused by something that was incredibly heavy seemed just behind her left ear. She slowly pivoted around and saw nothing, no matter how far she turned. Still, Saundra wasn't frightened. She heard whatever it was creeping closer. She shouted the name Jeremy, hoping to catch her older brother in one of his many pranks. As she quickly turned around, nothing. Jeremy, if you're trying to scare me, it won't work. You know I can hear you, she called out. Still, behind her, she heard it coming closer. She thought about running off into the woods to get away from whatever it was, but it was upon her. She smelled the wretched stink of its breath, for how could she not? The warmth of it was on her neck. Running might lead to her falling, twisting her ankle, and being left for dead. She might run into a tree or fall into a hole. Saundra was frozen in fear until she heard the voice of her father break her thoughts. She remembered the story he told her of the thing that crept up and followed hikers in Dagger Woods. Its howling terrified them into running and injuring themselves and becoming lost. Then it would feed. Saundra remembered the name that he told her, the Hidey Hinder. She had a way out. The only way to escape the entity was to get a good look at it. She didn't have a mirror to show the thing its own reflection, so it would have to see its reflection in her eyes. It moved closer and snickered and laughed at her. She spun about, trying to get a glimpse of it, but saw nothing. Twirling and whirling, nothing. 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 She had to stop when she almost lost her balance. You'd like that, Saundra thought to herself. You'd like that a whole lot, wouldn't you, Mr. Hidey Hinder? You'd like if I tripped and fell and hurt myself. You'd laugh at me while I lay there and rotted down into something soft enough for your old rotten teeth. As the world stopped spinning, Saundra felt it right behind her. Then came the sensation of its tongue, licking against her ear. Run. Saundra took off, running through Dagger Woods as fast as she could. She tried to get a look behind her and get a glimpse of it, but it still wasn't there. There was only the fleeting glimpse of its shadow. It was enormous, far bigger than any mortal shadow should be, and she knew it was hungry. Run for the stream over the hill, came her father's voice in her head as her feet carried her swiftly across the forest floor. She knew she just had to remain in front of it after all. It wasn't trying to catch her. It was trying to scare her. She got over the hill and came within eyeshot of the stream. As she reached it, Saundra collapsed to her knees, and in the reflection of the water she saw it. Behind her. As quick as she saw it, the Hidey Hinder disappeared into a shroud of smoke and was gone. Saundra got herself together and ran the rest of the way home. When she got there, she hugged each and every one of her family members tightly and told them what happened. They believed her and asked what it looked like. Saundra didn't ever say, or quite possibly wasn't ever able to. Her story says it took a long time before she was able to walk in Dagger Woods again, but always carried a mirror with her when she went, in case the Hidey Hinder ever paid her another visit. So outside of what I've told you, there's not much more reference material on the cryptid known as the Hidey Hinder. Even in the local legends books of Nova Scotia, an awesome one by Steve Vernon that I used to reference this episode, there's no trace of the Hidey Hinder, the Dagger Woods Howler, or any other instances involving Dagger Woods mentioned. It is a true local legend, and like all other cryptid stories, It's one that needs to be told and not forgotten. So this is where we'll take a break from what is traditionally known about the Hidey Hinder and attempt to unmask what it is for ourselves. I have a few theories about what it could possibly be. The first is that the Hidey Hinder might be a creature we haven't touched on yet in this podcast, an indigenous Navajo legend of an entity known as a skinwalker. As the Navajo culture tells it, skinwalkers are malicious witches who possess the ability to change into, possess, or disguise themselves as animals. They are contradictory to those who are healers and attempt to practice their works for the betterment of their people. So why a skinwalker? Well, transforming into animals of the forest, especially smaller animals, would allow the Hidey Hinder the ability to sneak up behind people without being seen. It's quite possible that should it become something small, like a squirrel or a chipmunk, that anyone turning about, like Saundra did, wouldn't notice it. Quite frequently, skinwalkers can turn into tricky animals, like coyotes. This might help explain the howling noises that are frequently heard in the stories about the Hidey Hinder. The inhuman howling might also be attributed to foxes, which are abundant in Nova Scotia and make a myriad of weird sounds. Sounds that you might attribute to inhuman howling or growling. Skinwalkers also have the ability to possess animals, humans, and can even walk around in their bodies. Could it be that the Hidey Hinder, which believedly came over from the old world, possessed the body of a passenger or an animal on a ship bound for North America? I think it's quite possible. But with that being said, skinwalkers also seem to cause mischief and not outrightly hurt people. And that might explain why, in Saundra's story, she knew it didn't want to harm her, but rather torment her. And that bleeds us into my second and final theory about what the creature actually is, that it's either a Wendigo or a Wendigo spirit. As I covered the Wendigo in our Folklore Appendices chapter just before chapter 18 on the 1st of November last year, I won't go into much detail about what a Wendigo is. I suggest you go listen to that episode after this one for further understanding. We know that the Wendigo is a bloodthirsty entity in corporeal form and stalks those and attacks those it comes across. It strikes terror into those who wander in the woods, and if you hear strange noises, animals making noise that don't sound normal, or your name being called, no, you didn't. You turn and you run the other way. You run far, back the way you came, and you don't stop until you're home. We know that the Wendigo can have an ethereal form as well, one that can possess and inhabit bodies of humans. Remember back to the story I told you of Kakisi-Kuchin, or Swift Runner, an indigenous man of the Cree community, who did the unimaginable to survive the harsh winter of 1878 in Alberta. After witnessing many in his community and his own family die of starvation, he took his wife and 6 children into the woods, and he killed them and ate them. After the winter, he turned himself in to the Northwest Mounted Police Detachment, today the RCMP, saying that his family was dead. When they investigated, they found the bodies of his family. There were bones everywhere, some snapped in half, others hollowed out. They concluded that someone had killed them, cut them open, took their bones, and ate the marrow from them. They even found a pot full of human fat at the campsite. Swift Runner attempted to plead that he was possessed by the evil spirit of the Wendigo, a spirit that caused him to murder and eat his family. The explanation wasn't bought, and at his trial the following year, after only 20 minutes of deliberation, the jury sentenced Swift Runner to death. He was hung on the 20th of December in 1879 in Fort Saskatchewan, Alberta. 20 minutes from where I'm recording this episode. If we believe the Hidey Hinder to be a Wendigo, there are some similarities. Looking at the origin story, it's possible that Jill's husband murdered her and her family, waking the spirit of the Wendigo that possessed his body and hasn't given him a moment since. It's also possible that they encountered a physical Wendigo that attacked the husband and drugged Jill and their children to their demise. It also made a good amount of noise to signal it was coming, and didn't sound natural, which the Wendigo is known to do. I believe the Hidey Hinder to be a Wendigo. It shares far too many similarities to what we've already seen in Swift Runner and his murders of his family. I would find it hard to believe that a physical entity would have come over on a ship from Europe, on a journey that took months in the 18th century. It would have been easily noticed, no matter how deep down in the hold it might have hid. If it was feasting on passengers or crew, their shipmates would have noticed them going missing. And let me stop there before I get into something akin to the Voyage of the Demeter and the Legend of Dracula. So it must have come over, if it came over at all and wasn't there in the beginning, as a spirit. Whether that spirit lingered below, or had possessed one of the passengers or crew, remains to be seen, and we'll never know. Alternatively, it might not have come over on a ship at all. Our world is ancient, and it's entirely possible that this spirit, or entity, is preternatural, predating the modern era, and something that has transcended time. As those indigenous to Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq have existed for centuries, before the first settlers, then it lends further credence to why I truly believe it's a Wendigo spirit. One as ancient as time, and one that might have been lost to the stories told by the Mi'kmaq and their ancestors in the earliest days. They might not have even known what a Wendigo spirit was, as the legend is of course Cree and Ojibwe in descent. It might have even been driven out of where it lived, and Dagger Woods might have been its resting place, until the unluckiest of souls, and the most horrific of acts awoke it. But the Dagger Woods Howler, the Hidey Hinder, remains a cryptid, something that's been told of in stories, but there remains no actual proof of. Perhaps it doesn't exist at all, and these are simply stories designed to capture the attention of anyone who will listen. Perhaps, if you're in northeastern Nova Scotia, you can go to Dagger Woods and look for yourself. But if you wander through the woods, be careful. You'll never hear it coming. You'll never see it coming. And you might never be seen or heard from again. Just maybe it's still there, sleeping, hiding, and waiting in its lair, somewhere deep in Dagger Woods. So we've finally made it to the end of the episode. You've heard the story of the Hidey Hinder as I tell it. Let me turn it over to a band that's near and dear to my heart, all the way from home in Nova Scotia, the Stanfields, from their 2010 debut album, Vanguard of the Young and Reckless. This is Dagger Woods. Please enjoy.
Not long ago, outside of town, 10 miles or so, man and wife and two small babies camping in the glade. On an Indian summer getaway, a weekend full of rest and play. Tuckered out from their full day, now sitting round the fire. But lurking in the shadows was a two-man with a big old set of eyes. And and an appetite for souls like these, feeding time to night. They never heard it coming, they never saw it coming, they were never seen or heard from again. The Hidey Hinder, through the gates of Hades, overcame Daddy, and took the mama and babies. The Hidey Hinder, done took them good, back to its lair, deep in Dagger Woods. Well, the tale begins hundreds of years through the countless days and hours when the golden plow first broke the land. Folks started disappearing. The locals swear beyond a doubt it came over on the first slow boat, that bloodthirsty monster they call the Hidey Hinder. An old world apparition hitched a ride to the new world in disguise. Supernatural baggage in the hold from a hard life left behind. If they knew what they was bringing, I sure would not be singing about people never seen or heard again. The Hidey Hinder of the old world nations, you've reigned in terror for 7 generations. Oh, Hidey Hinder, I wish I could prove you exist deep in Dagger Woods. What I'm telling you, said such a thing cannot be true. He locked me up for murder and threw away the key. He said the only monster that he's seen sits right before his eyes. He stared me down, shook his head and condemned me as a sick man telling lies. I should have seen it coming, should have known that it was coming. Now I'll never see the light of day again. Oh, Hidey Hinder of a million babies, I know to be true, my Jilly and my babies. Oh, Hidey Hinder, you done took them good away from me, deep in Dagger Woods. No, that's where I should be, in Dagger Woods, hanging from a tree in Dagger Woods, for all the world to see. Dagger Woods, back with my family in Dagger Woods. Sing 'em.
I'd love to say with this message we bring to close the story of the Hidey Hinder, but as it remains a cryptid, it's still out there. And if you're a skeptic, then you can't tell me otherwise. I hope you enjoyed this week's story and the return to the Folklore Appendices series. I love the stories surrounding Nova Scotia and its many legends. This is just another one of those that I plan to bring to the attention of the world through this podcast. Of course, a big thank you goes out to the Stanfields, who were gracious enough to allow me to use their song Dagger Woods in today's episode. I'm always proud to be able to highlight the wonderful talent coming out of Nova Scotia, and I certainly hope you keep listening to their other amazing songs. Your mission this week, and I hope you accept it, is for those listening or who have access to the Spotify app. If you could go on the podcast's main page, and just below the follow button, there's a star button. If you could leave a review, that would be amazing. It helps the podcast out with the algorithm and helps other new listeners discover my amazing stories. Before you go, and while you're in the Spotify app, it'd be super awesome if you could subscribe or follow the podcast wherever you're listening from. That way you can find your way back next week for another amazing episode. It's almost September, which will put us on the road to Halloween. For those who were around last year, you can attest to how amazing October it is for this podcast's content. I even have a special guest who will be joining the podcast for an episode in October. New episodes of the Insidious Agenda podcast release every Tuesday at midnight Eastern Standard Time. But for now, it's time to close the cover of the Insidious Agenda. As always, I've been your host, Nick, and I want to thank you very much for listening. I'll see you again next week.
Hidey Hinder, done took 'em good, back to its lair.